Well, hello to everyone. This is James Kraybill again. We are in a second week of looking at context. Last week, we were looking at ethnic tensions and conflict around the world. This week, we want to look at polarization uh, in North America, but just in general, as a concept that the church has to navigate and that we live among. And we've invited Nelson Kraybill, who for me is a longtime friend. He was a once president of AMBS, for those of you who may or may not know that. I've been in small groups with him. He was my pastor at Prairie Street Mennonite Church. He's currently the president of Mennonite World Conference. So if you intend to attend the gathering in Indonesia next year, you are likely to see him and meet him. So he's been doing some reflection on this issue of polarization. And my first encounter with discussing this with him was about a book that he had been reading called The Righteous Mind. Maybe that's a place to start. Just say a word about what this author is proposing.
Well, thank you, James, and it's a privilege to be with this class. I've been paying attention to a book called The Righteous Mind. It's a book written by Jonathan Haidt, who's I think he describes himself as a moral psychologist. It's not a new book. It was, I think, published in 2012. And Haidt tries to understand why American society has become polarized and pulled into different conflicting groups. And Haidt says that many of us make moral decisions out of deep intuition. He calls the intuition that predisposition to decide moral issues one way or another. So when we approach a question like abortion or racism or other matters where there are moral decisions to be made, we have a whole lifetime of experience, family background, church or political background, life experiences we've had, things we've been taught or not taught that tilt us one way or another. And he says this intuition is like an elephant that we are riding. And as we approach a moral decision, the elephant, our intuition, often unconscious, just begins to lean one way or the other. And he says that people who lean toward the left in the political or theological spectrum tend to emphasize care for the marginal people, liberty and fairness, care, liberty, and fairness. And people on the right of the spectrum tend to emphasize loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And so on an issue like Lives Matter, I'm just trying to apply this. People on the left say it is not fair, it is not right that somebody be killed by the police before they even get to trial. People on the right tend to say, well, but we need law and order. We can't just have chaos in the streets. So we need to have guns. We need to have police around. That's just a quick example. And then, James, I try to take this grid and apply it both to the biblical world, the Bible itself, the text of the Bible, and to some extent to the New Testament era, and try to understand why there are diverse perspectives within the Bible. What kind of intuition and background predisposition is shaping biblical authors in where they come down on issues that seem diverse
So
in their
it's good to
interpretation.
know we're not the first ones to face this. Take us back to sort of the biblical context. how did that play out in the biblical world?
Well, an example that I'm putting into the writing that I'm working on right now is after the Jews came back from Babylon, they were trying to, theologians in ancient Israel were trying to determine what had gone wrong that we were in exile. And as you read the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, most of that historical material builds the argument that the reason the Jews went into exile was because of idolatry and because they were unfaithful. So when the Jews come back from Babylon, we have the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, and they now are trying to do it right. Darn it, we are not going to fail again. We are going to obey the law. And so Ezra is teaching the law. Um, and Ezra's ministry of teaching the law ends with the Jewish men divorcing their Canaanite wives and sending their wives and children away because the Torah, the law of Moses, says don't marry the Canaanites. They married Canaanites. About the same time, it appears, two different authors looked at ancient stories that had been transmitted, I assume, by the oral tradition down through the years, wrote these books up in what we call the books of Jonah and the books of Ruth. In the book of Jonah, Jonah is called to carry the good news of God's love to Assyria, to Nineveh, to the enemy that destroyed the northern tribes of Israel. The book of Ruth, of course, is the story of a Moabite woman coming into Israel, marrying into Israel. A widow marries Boaz and becomes what grandmother of King David. So you have these two stories that are about openness to foreigners coming in that seem to stand over against the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, both of these perspectives are within our canon. One was not chucked out, they're both there. And I'm identifying other examples of that within the Bible where we have not exactly conflicting perspectives or not even quite contradictory. They're just contrasting, very different. And in the New Testament era, we would see Jews at that time, say at the time Jesus was born, there were two main houses of interpretation, they were called. These were really like schools of rabbinic interpretation, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel. Hillel was the liberal perspective. Shammai was the conservative perspective. An example of an issue they would debate was if you go to a wedding and you greet the bride and she is beautiful, what should you say? Well, you should say, you're beautiful. But what if the bride is ugly? What do you say? The house of Shammai said, well, you always tell the truth. You tell her she's ugly. Hillel said, no, there's a larger law at work here. It's the law of love. Every bride is beautiful on her wedding day. Don't tell her she's ugly. She's beautiful. And so these rabbis would debate this kind of thing. Well, you can see the two you could pretty easily put those two perspectives within this kind of analysis. Let me pause and see if you have response here, James. Anything you want to pick up on?
Wow. Yeah, that really takes me down an interesting track. I mean, that's that's an interesting dilemma because usually you think of the big ethical issues, for us, for example, as being things like abortion or whatever. But to pick an example of what you say to a bride gets pretty nitty gritty. But it actually illustrates really well sort of the two perspectives. And I liked what you said at the beginning, that we have these intuitions of how to respond, and they are all formed by our training, the context we grew up in, and so on. And we have to discipline ourselves actually to even hear the other side, to imagine that they believe what they believe as much as we do, and to choose our words carefully if we're going to live in community, because we can't be sniping at each other all the time if we're going to make any progress toward community. So,
Well,
how does that play out? Well, go ahead, say what you wanted to say.
we should expect that these big issues are going to have different perspectives within the church and still be one church. I'm sobered by the fact that the early church took 300 years to decide the limits of the canon, that is, what books would be included in the New Testament. It wasn't until AD 367 that we have the first record of the 27 books that we call the New Testament. That means that for 300 years, the early church was using different books and different configurations, which means they would have made some differing moral choices. And then even within the canon that we get of the New Testament, an example of a major contrasting argument is, how should Christians relate to the Roman Empire? The Apostle Paul, Romans 13, says this authority is put there by God. You obey the law. You pay your taxes. You shape up and behave. A generation later, after the Roman Empire killed Paul, after the Roman Empire destroyed Jerusalem, after the Roman Empire started to persecute Christians, then you have the book of Revelation written, and you have Revelation 13, which you can put over against Romans 13, and Revelation 13 makes the Roman Empire to be a beast from hell, or its authority is from hell, have nothing to do with it. Paul wanted to take the gospel to Nero. John of Patmos said, have nothing to do with it. Okay, which is the biblical perspective? They're both there within the New Testament. So I'm of a mind to say the rabbis of Jesus' time, and even Jesus himself, in how he argued with the Pharisees and debated with them, expected that there's going to be different perspectives on quite a number of issues, which raises the question of, what is at the center? What holds us together? And a lawyer once came to test Jesus and said, what must I do to come into the kingdom of God? And Jesus ends up saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Do this and you will live. That's at the core. So somehow Jesus' counsel of love, which I think we again see in Matthew 25, where there's the final judgment and the sheep and the goats are being separated, and people say, Lord, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you thirsty? When did we see you naked and feed you or not care for you? And that in the end for Jesus seems to be the criterion, is or even Paul says, the greatest of these is love. Like that's the final measure. But we need these diverse perspectives, just like the Talmud, this collection of Jewish thought, 6,000 pages. All the debate gets included. The pro and the con on every issue. The whole thing is there, and it's out of that matrix of debate that the whole of Jewish identity functions and has for 2,000 years. And I think Christian understandings can be somewhat similar. We need to recognize the diversity within the Bible, Old and New Testament, say on the issue of war and peace. We can't just pick some verses and ignore the others. We have to somehow see the whole. And it's out of the whole then that my intuition and background and your intuition and background meet. And the wisdom of the community carries the day. It's not just individually what I want. I accede to, or I guess I would say submit to, the wider authority of the Christian community. And we are not solo Lone Ranger
Mhm.
Christians.
So this course has been called God's Shalom and the Church's Witness. And we keep exploring what is the big project of reconciliation that God is working on in Jesus Christ. And then what is the role of the church in being ministers or ambassadors of this plan? It's not our project, it's God's project. At the end, each of the students is going to write a paper on some area of conflict and try to apply the principles that we've been batting around this semester to that context and say, well, this might be what the church would do in that context. So, we're going to get quite a few different illustrations of what this looks like. But I'm just sort of curious, even in your role as president of Mennonite World Conference, we are so diverse in the global family as well, not to mention just in North America, where we are almost dysfunctionally uh, at odds with each other. Um, we're not getting many models from the church, from society as to how to work at this. What's your counsel for this special calling the church has, either in North America or in any situation that you've experienced in the global family that can keep us focused on our primary calling and keep us working on this thing?
Every functioning community, religious or otherwise, needs some kind of central core that keeps it together. The New Jerusalem in Revelation has boundaries, but Christ is at the center. And the doors are always open in this city. People can come and go. So, I mean, to me, that's a model of the church. We set boundaries, but I don't like rigid boundaries that keep people out. The doors are always open. What really matters is what's at the center. The teaching of the church is clear. These are boundaries, and people come and go. For Mennonite World Conference, I'm just thinking of the global Mennonite community. I had the privilege in 2003 of being part of the group of people, of theologians that wrote what we call the shared convictions of Mennonite World Conference. It's just 7 or 8 statements, but the World Mennonite body recognized that we were so diverse that we needed to clarify what was at the center. And if you read those shared convictions, and anyone can find them if you just Google shared convictions Mennonite World Conference, you'll get right to it, are pretty basic. I mean, they don't break down, say, issues of sexuality, or doesn't go into much detail on the moral issues. It says these basic confessions of Jesus is God's Son, God's reconciling the world to himself. We commit to faith community. We see the scriptures authoritative. We had to keep the core commitments pretty simple and pretty basic, because once you start breaking it down into more detail, then you're going to fragment. And I think that's what the Hebrew scriptures do in saying, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God. You shall worship that God alone. No, and then maybe the 10 Commandments. It's just this core statement. In the New Testament, it might be I don't know, the Sermon on the Mount or even the Beatitudes. That's the core. And so we need to focus as a church, I think, on these are the core convictions that hold us together. But then my instinct now, as I reflect more on this research and in my own experience in the church, is to be fairly gracious on where the doors are shut. At least we need to clarify what the boundaries of the church are. But I mean, for me, if we moved beyond, say, understanding God as Trinitarian, if we got to the point of saying God is not three persons, to me, it would no longer be Christianity. That to me would be a deal breaker. But that's a pretty basic agreement that Christians have, and I think Mennonites can have. How we live that out in the world, I don't have a ready answer for that other than, I mean, I'm sure you're working with 2 Corinthians, what is it, 5? God was in Christ reconciling the world to
Right.
himself and giving to us the ministry of reconciliation. In Revelation, that ministry is the river of the water of life, which goes out beyond the city. It flows out of the city into the world, and it's for the healing of the nations. We are out there being agents of healing, and it's maybe beyond our conversation here to go into a lot of details of what that means. Mission work that you and many others have been involved in, and that I've been involved in Elkhart community or in Western Europe.
Hmm. Charitable convictions.
Something like that. Yeah, we need both. We need the
Yeah.
conviction and be clear of what's at the center for ourselves and our congregations, our denominations, and then some charity and where people are at in understanding and receiving that.
This has been very helpful. Thank you so much. I'm anxious to hear how the students respond. They'll have a chance to listen to this and respond on Moodle with any reactions they have. If something comes up, I see you every now and then. I can share with you some of what's come of it. But thank you so much for taking your time and sharing these important insights this week in particular when we're looking at our polarized world and the role of the church. Blessings to you. Blessings to you next year as you give leadership to Mennonite World Conference in a pandemic, which probably is not going to just disappear between now and then. So we wish you all the best. Stay healthy, and thank you for your leadership.
Indonesia, July 2022. Be there.
Amen.
Shalom.